Good morning. I expect this to be a fairly short video, but I wanted to draw your attention to this. Darren T has been YouTubing about OpenToonz for several years now. He can truly be called an expert on OpenToonz, and he just released this training course. So if you're a newbie to 2D animation and you want to dive in as efficiently and effectively as possible, then you might want to consider this course, which is, I think it's like $25. I mean, it's quite cheap. And Darren does a super good job of covering not only the features of a program, but he really gets into the nuance of how to use the different tools with practical application, blah, blah, blah. So check out this video, OpenToonz Training Course now out. If you search that or go to the channel for Darren T, I'm sure you'll find it. And support Darren. He's doing great work here on YouTube. Now, Darren himself actually asked me in a comment the other day about seeing some of my animation workflow in a finished project with the shots all cut together in the style that I have currently been embracing for the cartoon that I'm working on. The basic reason for some changes in my own workflow have really had to do with efficiency. If I want to be able to crank out an entire episode of a cartoon in, well, at the most 90 days, but if it were up to me, I would love to even compress it into a month. Then I've had to make certain compromises that have affected the style, and the biggest change would be to embrace a characterization style that doesn't require all the ink and paint process that one normally would associate with, say, an anime type production. Okay, what am I talking about? The main thing is, and you can see it in this shot right here, is that if you notice, most of the borders, or not most I should say, but some of the borders between color areas do not actually have outlines around them. And the reason, in short, is that I'm just drawing the shapes of color and then judiciously going in and adding outlines to delineate borders as necessary, and also doing, in many cases, some post-production effects that use compositing to put outlines around the characters sort of automatically. Okay, so Darren had asked the question, well, what does this actually look like? So I'm going to show you kind of the first minute of this cartoon I'm working on. Some aspects of it are still in rough form. You know, the music in the background, I literally composed 8 bars and just threw it in there as a backdrop. But let me just go ahead and play this so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. So this is going to take about 1 minute.
Of the days following the Great Flood, much has been lost to the mists of time. One tale that remains is that of the legendary high priest, Melchizedek.
When Melchizedek was 50 years old, well, not quite. I wasn't 50. I was 15. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. Now, before I tell you my story, I have to give you some background.
And on it goes.
See,
so
I come from a
basically
land
Mel
called
is
Newsy.
narrating the story. So, so as you can see, again, I'm adopting a fairly more cartoony style. Frankly, a more modern style. Now, this particular shot was done more in the traditional anime style where I did outlines and fills, and frankly, the shot's probably going to get redone. Here you can see where the outlines around the characters were actually done automatically in software. Here you can see there is actually no outline around his hair, and on it goes. So the style is still evolving, but basically the upshot of the story is that this 1 minute of animation was all done in about 4 days. And so what I'm finding is that the ability to get to the point where I'm cranking out 30 seconds, let's say, pretty consistently in one, in a day, it's actually happening. This shot, as an example, to kind of wrap up this video, this shot is very exemplary of what I've been doing. In Krita, I simply created 3 flat images: the background, this character, and this character. And then I brought those images into Blender, and I can get into how to do this in more detail maybe in another video, but basically I just created an armature and a bone system and parented it to this picture, created another armature and parented it to this picture, and then just threw in some animation keys. Another thing I'm doing to keep my efficiencies manageable, and by the way, obviously the camera move is dead easy. You can see the camera moving. Dead easy to do in Blender. You can do this in OpenToonz. There's nothing you're seeing here that couldn't be done in OpenToonz. It's just that at this point, I'm finding I favor Blender. It seems to be a little faster, and the things that I'm trying to do tend to be more stable. So what I was about to say is another thing I've been doing is everything is being done at 8 frames per second. So that's, if you're used to anime, that's completely normal. Your most modern stuff that you see on, your Disney channels and your Nickelodeons tends to be a full 24 frames per second. So in that sense, it's a little bit more of a dated sort of style. But what that does for me is it allows me to bring these image sequences into Vegas, which is the editor I use, and I bring them into Vegas at the Vegas timeline is 24 frames a second. So all I have to do is the following. I just drag the image sequence in here, and then I grab its properties and I make it play back at 0.333, and I disable resampling so it doesn't try to interpolate in between the frames digitally. And what that does is it causes this
That's what I'm talking about.
causes it to play back at 8 frames a second on a 24 frame per second timeline. And what that does also is it means that Vegas is only having to actually process 1/3 as many frames in order to give you the same final show that you would otherwise have if you did this at 24 frames per second on 3s, in which case many of the frames would be repeating 3 times, which is something I'm kind of wanting to avoid. So really embracing the 8 frame per second workflow and the aesthetic that goes with it, as well as the again, I would call it a little bit more modern, a little bit more cartoony, as opposed to a more traditional anime type of look. The result has been that the work is moving much, much faster, because essentially I can go from a pencil test. If I was doing this in Blender, I'll actually demonstrate really quick what that would look like. Let me save this, and then this will be kind of the wrap up of the video for today. The way this might look in Blender, usually I do this in Krita. The initial pencil test and ink and paint I've been doing in Krita, but I'm moving more and more towards Blender again for this reason. If I go in here and I say I draw a character, okay, so let me just make this kind of like the old Mel character that you saw in the previous shot. Okay, so he has kind of a round chin, kind of big bushy eyebrows, and in this case we'll make his eyes super simple just to keep things, keep them simple. Okay, so now you say, well, we want to do ink and paint. To draw lines around this, first of all, you can't do fill operations in Blender anyway. You can in Blender 2.8, but for various reasons I won't get into, I'm not really embracing the 2.8 and now 2.9 series. And although I'm dabbling in it, because there's a couple things that you can do in Blender 2.81, quite literally only a couple things actually, that you can't do in Blender 2.79. So again, won't get into what those consist of at this point, but basically here's the point. In a traditional workflow, what you would do is you'd probably go, you take your ink pen, you draw these outlines. I'm just doing them real sketchy just to demonstrate. Okay, and then you'd have to go ahead and do the fill operations to color all this stuff in. So my concept was, well, is it possible to eliminate that step entirely? And the answer is, indeed you can. Here's how you would want to do it, is you would basically say, well, let's just use solid colors here, like so. Okay, and now let's kind of work from back to front, like this. And now we know that this has to be kind of a dark green color. So we, boom, we match that color, that's fine. Now we go here. And, you know, as far as the back to front workflow, it's easy to make a mistake and then you got to go in and sort of patch things. But then it's fairly easy to just, you know, clean this up a bit, like so, blah, blah, blah. And then again, we want the right color here, obviously. So Mel's hair is kind of a real desaturated purple. Boom. And finally, let's use solid black here. So we can just go like that, maybe something like that. Okay. And maybe something like that. Okay, and then we're going to grab the shadows, put those guys in. Maybe something like that. Okay, and then again, what I might do is just go ahead and you know, judiciously go ahead and ink over some of the interiors, and in some cases I would go ahead and do a sketch kind of line like that. And now if I get rid of my sketch layer, this is what I'm left with. Okay, so I did that really fast, so it's not as perfect as it should be, but the basic concept is fine, and you can easily go in and sort of fix things. And now if I actually did this initial art in Blender, then I would actually render it out in most cases and map it back to a plane for final animation. So, and in this case I would also probably have something like this. So to give it a little dimensionality, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so that's kind of how things are working in Blender. And then the kind of the upshot is that by working this way in Krita, just drawing shapes and then, you know, kind of doing the minimum of traditional ink and paint, once I sort of got that workflow figured out, I realized, wait a second, that same workflow works perfectly well in Blender. Why am I doing my initial drawings in Krita? And the truth is, at this point, I don't care. The key difference is this. Once you start to animate anything in Krita, things get really unstable really quick. So if you save your work every time you do something, it's not a big deal. But Krita is extremely crash prone, whereas Blender, by comparison, has only crashed, you know, maybe twice in the last year. Now I will say this about Blender 2.8. The Blender 2.8 series, the advantage it gives me that Blender 2.79 can't would really be this. I can draw this shape, and then let's say I want to add some shadows, and I want to have them masked. So let's take the filled shadow here, and let's just say we put a shadow here. Well, in Blender 2.8 you can do this. You can mask it, and you can do that also in Krita. So that's a kind of actually a surprisingly big advantage that can become quite a major time saver. Which is why I am still toying with Blender 2.8, but only in the sense of Blender 2.81 specifically. Because there are enough changes, starting with I think 2.83 and now definitely going forward into 2.9, where for all intents and purposes, in my opinion, it's a new piece of software. Because there are conventions in Blender, like one would be selecting things with your right mouse button. I've been selecting stuff with my right mouse button for 20 years because I've been using Blender since before the year 2000. And now all of a sudden in 2.8, I think it was 8.3 and forward, the default is the left mouse button. Well, for most people coming from other software, that's fine. That's actually a good thing. For me, it's not such a good thing. Another example would be in Blender 2.81, you can click in your timeline and just scroll anywhere in order to jump around in your frames. Well, again, I think it was 2.83. Now you have to grab this little tiny header here. You can't just grab and you're there like this. You have to grab this thing and drag it. I'm not sure why they did that, but that's just two of a plethora of changes that have made Blender 2.83 and forward, especially 2.9, which was recently released. Awesome, powerful program. Like, there's nothing you can't do. For me, doesn't work into my workflow that well because of some of the things they just decided to change. And the interface is in some ways almost inscrutable, where I would have to really start from scratch, sort of relearning what all the little buttons and icons do. So that's just quite literally the only thing that Blender 2.8 gives me in terms of my workflow over 2.79 is this, the masking. That's like almost the only thing. Well, it also has fill operations. So to be fair, in Blender 2.8, I can do this. I can draw a shape, and then I can grab a color, and I can fill it. You can't do that in Blender 2.79. So those two things are kind of the two biggies that are causing me to keep Blender 2.81 handy on my system so I can sort of reacclimate over to it as needed. But in the meantime, what seems to be working the best is to embrace the idea that in your workflow, creating your characters generally and animating them are kind of two different steps. The two flow together when you're doing a pencil test, but what I'm finding is I analyze that pencil test and I say, okay, this little bit here, this, maybe only the guy's head moves. So I'm not going to draw the body over and over. I'm going to draw it one time. And more, what's actually going to happen is I'm probably going to be creating grease pencil objects like this one of a given character's face, perhaps with keyframes so that maybe it's a head turn, that I can then just literally drag that or import that grease pencil object into any other scene and instantly be able to reuse assets. It just becomes really important when you're dealing with a project that is, in this case, the episode I just showed the first 40 seconds of or so. That episode is 48 minutes long. Now there's a lot of other stuff that's been animated that I didn't show today, especially at the end of the show. The entire final act, or sequence I should say, it's not the final act, but it's several minutes of show are also completed. So anyway, that's that. Again, be sure to check out Darren T's course. It looks real good. And I will get back into kind of deconstructing one shot at a time, I think, and showing, kind of just how I'm doing what I'm doing in the next video. And until then, as you guys know, there will be more later.